Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. As you can see, we have changed things up a bit. We're no longer in the studio. We are here in sunny Orlando, Florida at CPAC. And joining us now, we have Kevin Roberts, president of the Heritage Foundation. Let's hear what he has to say about the Ukraine-Russia crisis, how China plays in, and how America can be more competitive with China. Let's dive in. Kevin Roberts, thank you so much for joining us today. Great to have you.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks.
And so you're the president of the Heritage Foundation, which is quite an influential think tank here in Washington. And so what are you doing as the organization to really tackle kind of the China threat?
Two things, Tiffany. The first is because we have such a big media platform and we're one of the largest policy groups in the world, is using our media platform, our communications ability to define the narrative, to write a headline, which is, just to speak very plainly, the Chinese Communist Party is the greatest threat to human freedom and life in the world. That is not hyperbole, that's not an exaggeration. I lead a think tank, so we're very careful about what we say. And so a lot of it is rhetoric, but the second thing is the substance. We have a team of dozens of researchers in foreign policy and Asia policy. What we're in the middle of doing right now, literally as we sit here, is setting up a roadmap for Congress to pass legislation that's meaningful, that allows America to address that threat. There is some legislation, as you may be aware, in Congress on this. It's not only not meaningful, it's actually pretty harmful. And what we need to do moving forward, just to sum up, is to make sure that the moneyed interests of the CCP are a lot less influential in our nation's capital.
And so I think part of when you took the role, you hammered home the point of education being very important. And so what are some ways of really helping students, right? Because it seems like a lot of the communist ideology has seeped into the education system kind of unknowingly to many. So what are some ways of stemming that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because two things, one on higher ed and then one on K through 12. In higher ed, and not just because of the Confucius Institutes, but because of some really savvy funding by the CCP in research grants, including, very surprisingly, in some military and military-involved technology. Students are being taught by professors who believe that at worst, the Chinese Communist Party is fine, and some of them even celebrate it. And so it's very important that Congress take action to disconnect that money. Students in college, I want to be really clear, have this misunderstanding about the threat posed by the CCP, by the evil that they propagate every day, not because they're dumb, not because they're uneducated, but because of the connections that the CCP has very methodically made into research universities in particular. What's worse is that in K through 12 classrooms, because those teachers are trained by university professors, we see the same kind of thing. But there is something that's sort of particular to our K through 12 schools, and that is just a misunderstanding about the limitations of the economic system of the Chinese Communist Party. Let's just put their evil actions aside and just talk about the economic system of communism, of totalitarianism. We have students K through 12 who think that it's okay, that it actually sounds good. And perhaps on a level it does, but the reason they can believe that is because we don't do a good job in the United States of explaining the importance of the free market, the importance of freedom, the importance of human flourishing, which you know, and I know your audience knows, is just endemic in a great way to the United States. We have to tell that story in a much better way.
And so speaking of the economic front, it seems like capitalism has really been villainized these days, right? And so these concepts of, say, everyone gets an equal share, these like communists, which are now called socialists, right, are really getting a lot of praise almost. And going back to kind of when China joined the World Trade Organization, the rhetoric there was the hope that China would become more democratic, more liberal. But it almost seems the opposite happened, that China made free markets less free. So now that China is the world's second largest economy, kind of what can be done to really reverse that?
I'll talk about what should be done, but I just want to acknowledge the wisdom in your question, because even I, as a public policy guy and a historian of the United States, was sort of hoodwinked. I was manipulated, and by that, I mean, that I believed in the American foreign policy posture toward China, that China was going to become a free market, sort of the promise of the Nixon doctrine in the early 70s. Not only was that wrong, not only was I wrong, but that's very wrong-headed for us to continue to think that's going to happen, because what the 30 people who control the Chinese Communist Party have done is flip that on its head very strategically, very methodically, to make it difficult for the United States to respond. And therefore, that's why the Heritage Foundation has really ramped up its rhetoric about the Chinese Communist Party affecting human lives and freedom around the world. What must be done, number one, is to make sure that lobbyists in Washington, D.C., who are lobbying directly or indirectly on behalf of the Chinese communists, cannot do that. We have to disallow that. The second thing we need to do is to make sure that we do not have CCP-funded institutes in American universities. And the third thing is we need to delist from stock markets American companies that have direct connections to the CCP-funded military and technological interests. If we do that, then I'm optimistic about the United States weathering this threat. What concerns me is that it's very difficult, even on the conservative side of the aisle, to convince everyone that it is such a threat that we need to take action.
Why do you think China has been able to really influence, say, even the conservative side, which usually is able to see through the lies almost? Why do you think that is?
Well, two reasons. The first is a good one. It is the heart of Americans to believe people. And I think that's true for folks who are left of center. As a conservative, I can speak more authoritatively about fellow conservatives. It's certainly our thought, our belief that we can trust people. And so we have trusted for a couple of decades that China would get there, that it would, of course, with its beautiful culture, be more like America in its economic system. That hasn't happened. But the second reason is something very nefarious, and I want to speak very plainly. We have allowed, in the United States, our freedoms, our freedom of association, our relatively free lobbying laws, to be used not just in support of the CCP, but against our interests as Americans. And it's crucial that this year, not next year, not next decade, this year, every conservative in the U.S. House and U.S. Senate recognize that threat and advance legislation to that end.
And so going back to one of your earlier points about how some of the laws or bills being passed in Congress are actually hurting us more, I'm curious your take on the America Competes Act, because it's labeled kind of as a, competitive against China bill especially, but some have been raising the concern that it's crippling the manufacturers that would be able to stand up for China. So what's your take about that whole thing?
There are three problems with the American Competes Act. I will say before getting to the first that the narrative framing of that sounds great, and it has probably convinced some folks, some members of Congress who otherwise would be skeptical toward China that it's a good bill. It's not. I'd want to speak very bluntly. It's awful. Both versions are bad. The intentions might be good, but what we do for a living at the Heritage Foundation is get into the facts, and the facts of the matter are bad. So number one, it does precisely what you say, that some of the incentives, some of the subsidies that are in the bill will redirect those subsidies to corporations that have been the worst actors, that is to say, who have been in the closest direct contact with CCP-funded entities. The second thing that it does is really put small businesses, therefore, American small businesses, at a tactical disadvantage. They're already suffering because of the overwrought COVID lockdowns. Their profit margins are much narrower than the large corporations. So we're just adding fuel to the fire for them. But the third thing I would say is, and we're seeing this around the world, American policymakers are really enamored with the so-called climate crisis. And there is funding in that bill that would dramatically undermine American fossil fuel interests. The Heritage Foundation is agnostic about where we get our power, but we're absolutely against those kinds of subsidies, not just because they don't work for Americans, but because, to bring all of this back to the Chinese Communist Party, that's precisely what the CCP is counting on, that we can harm America in one of its greatest industries, which is providing power to people.
So I've heard some takes that the bill, while marked as a nice package thing, is mostly recycled Build Back Better acts that didn't make it past, and there's a whole section on studying whales and stuff. But I'm just curious, so on the flip side, what would be a good bill that really would counter China?
Boy, I love that question. A good bill would have 3 or 4 parts to it. Let me say very clearly, a good bill would require you going to the American Competes Act and on your computer deleting every word of text and starting with a blank sheet of paper, literally. And then when you're writing that new bill, the first thing you do is you make it illegal for the Chinese Communist Party to have lobbyists in the nation's capital. I happen to think that if that happens, we're going to see pretty dramatic improvement. The second thing that we do is to make sure that the Chinese Communist Party cannot invest in American military and technological interests. We never would have allowed this to happen in the 1960s, 70s, or 80s with the Soviet Union. I don't understand why we continue to be hoodwinked by a nefarious regime. And the third thing we need to do is we need to disincentivize American companies from investing in CCP-funded military and technological interests. That's a little bit harder because in our free market system, you want to be able to trust CEOs, boards of directors, but everyone from NBA owners to big tech owners, CEOs are showing that they really don't care about American interests. In fact, so much so, some of them even celebrate the Chinese Communist Party.
I'm curious about your last point, because the Victims of Communism came out with a report recently, right, that named 8 major U.S. companies, like household names, like GE, Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, Intel, all these, and just how much they're funneling into China. And so GE, for example, is a huge contractor for the Pentagon, but also works with AVIC, which is China's largest aerospace and defense contractor. But the issue seems to be, these are private companies. It's like whether or not they're working with like blacklisted, like Hikvision, that's the government that can't work with them. It doesn't say anything about private companies. So what would be the solution then? Is it more legislation? How would you?
Yes, the solution is more legislation with an understanding that for all intents and purposes, we are at war with the Chinese Communist Party. And therefore, for those of us who believe significantly in free market principles and believe that the free market will, in almost every case in history, be able to correct the ills even of evil regimes like China has, in this case, China has become such a threat to American freedom, to freedom around the world, that it is, for those of us who are free market guys, an exception to that rule in history. And that therefore means we have to do the very drastic action of preventing that investment by American companies in CCP-funded entities. That's not something that we want to make a habit of. We want American companies to be free to invest around the world. But as a historian, I would point to history and say, we never would have done that after we declared war against Nazi Germany or against Japan in the 1940s. We never allowed that during the Cold War with the Soviet Union because we understood as a people that we have to draw the battle lines, and the first most effective way the United States can fight battles and wars as a representative republic is through our economy.
And so, speaking of the Cold War, some are saying we are in a current Cold War with China. So do you see that happening?
100%. And I just say, as you've heard me say already, I see things through a historical lens. And I would say the opposite if I thought so. But as a historian, I just see clearly our scholars at the Heritage Foundation, some of whom have very deep experience in China itself, we know that we're in a Cold War. And although it is not the subject of our conversation to talk about what's going on with Vladimir Putin and Ukraine, all of that is connected to what I hope is, in spite of all of that bad news, an awakening by Americans across the political spectrum that we are in a Cold War and we darn well better want to win it. Because if we don't, this particular enemy, the Chinese Communist Party, is light years more of a threat than the Soviet Union ever was.
Well, Kevin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.